Can you please share that screen with the agenda and everything? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Janice. We'll just wait for it to come up. So first of all, thanks very much to SMISO for providing those house rules for us, the guidelines on how to behave during this webinar, and to Mile for organizing this webinar, co-organizing with UKZN. My name is Dr. Sean O'Donoghue, and I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Change Adaptation in eThekwini
Ilobi,
Municipality.
please accept me. Oh, never mind.
Can you please mute yourself if you're not me? And I'm also wear another hat as a senior, as a research associate at UKZN. Um, so I have a foot in each camp, so to speak. Today we have two presenters, really interesting lineup. Firstly, we have Malcolm Canham, who's a senior manager from the city's disaster management unit, and he's going to talk to us about flood damage, contributing factors, response challenges, and plans for future events. And then we're going to have Professor Cathy Sutherland from the School of Development Studies, and who has been a long-time collaborator in the Durban Research Action Partnership and within the Palmead Catchment Rehabilitation Project. So we've gotten to have the benefit of Cathy's applied research in the city for many years now. Then afterwards, we'll have an open discussion. So can I please just check whether we have Malcolm online? Is Malcolm ready to present? And if you are, can you, I see MC there, so that I presume that's Malcolm. Please, can you start your sharing your screen, and we'll start the presentations. Thanks. It's nice to see such a good turnout today. Thanks very much to everyone for participating. Over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Dr. Sean, and good to hear your voice again. A very good morning to all the colleagues gathered in the seminar. And my presentation covers quite a bit, so hopefully I'll be able to get through. I see the allocated time is 25 minutes, but I will do my best to get through it in that time. My intention was then today, the request was initially to present on the impact of the heavy rains that we had in April and May, and the subsequent declared disaster. But I thought, in addition, let's maybe use the opportunity, as has been said, every moment is a teaching moment. So maybe to unpack a bit about disaster management, the discipline, the theory behind, and to have everyone then on a footing that understands what underpins disaster management. So we know that we are in the city of Durban, or within the eThekwini municipality, just pinpointed for those who might not be too familiar with the map of Africa, exactly where we are located. What is an emergency? What is a disaster? And this is where the challenge comes in. Any incident is normally labeled as a disaster, and so the terminology becomes interchangeable depending on who is using it. So it's important that we understand the difference between the two. So if we look at a disaster, it's a progressive, sudden, widespread, or localized incident. It can be natural or human-made, which then, and that is the hazard. So this is why you see that linked to that definition. So that's the incident that occurs. It's a hazard that impacts upon, and it can cause or threaten to cause death, injury, disease, damage to property or infrastructure in the environment, the disruption of community life and the system that we currently follow. That's where vulnerability comes in. We have to see, if that does happen, what is the impact then upon whomever it falls and whatever it falls. And then that hazard and the impact is of such a magnitude, it exceeds the ability of those affected by that hazard to cope with its effects using their own resources. That looks at capacity. So if we look at what's happened in April and May, and later on I'll indicate the current costing that has been estimated. When those two are put together, it looks at how it's impacted upon that community, and for us, the amount that is tallied exceeded our ability to cope, and the impact and the response to it exceeded our ability. That is why then the city, through the city manager, applied upward and to the presidency for a declaration of a national disaster. Of a local disaster, but we know that it became a national, it was declared a national disaster. Let's then unpack, what is disaster management? Disaster management, and it's everybody's business, we'll refer to that later, it's a continuous, it doesn't happen and then come to an end. It's a continuous, integrated, multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary process of risk identification, risk reduction, that all falls then into this planning and implementation of the measures aimed at preventing or reducing the risks of disasters. If we cannot prevent, how can we mitigate the severity of those, the impact of that? What preparedness measures do we have in place to deal with? So where are we at in terms of ability to respond? Then also we have to consider rapid and effective response to disasters, and that's what we saw in the last while. Thereafter, post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. In that rehabilitation comes reconstruction, and we'll talk a little more about that relative to what we have seen. So it's a continuous thing. It doesn't stop, but it's happening all the time, and everyone is involved in it. Let's look at our municipality a bit. So we know the area is 2,297 square kilometers. A population, I checked yesterday, 3.5 million. I think we would be way over that, and hopefully the latest census figures will come out to inform. The length of streams that we have, the coastline, our budget sits at just under 55 billion. And some stats relative to income in eThekwini. When we start to look at that, it starts to say, oh, if there's no income, that means our people then are in the poorer sector of society. Therefore, the vulnerability, we presume, is a little higher. So those figures inform levels of vulnerability. Where do we get our mandate? So we know that all legislation in the country derives from the Constitution. We don't have to dwell too much in that. The act that comes from Parliament is in the Disaster Management Act 57 of 2002, and it has been amended. From the act flows a framework. The act is underpinned by two things: prevention, and if we cannot prevent, mitigate. And then with those two in place, have the ability to respond. But the framework then says, how do we take the dictates of the act and break them down a little more into tangible working arrangements? So at national level, at provincial level, at local government level, a policy framework for disaster management was created, and the framework then is underpinned by certain issues, and I'll talk to that soon. So that's the legislative background. So let's unpack the framework now. The framework tasks everyone involved in disaster management, and disaster management is everybody's business, according to 4 key performance areas. So the first thing it says is get some sort of capacity going. So you have to have institutional arrangements, integrated they must be, because it brings together everyone in preparation, in preparedness. And then KPA 2 talks about undertaking a risk assessment, 3 risk reduction, 4 response and recovery, and then they're underpinned by 3 enablers. That says you must have the ability to communicate and manage information. So you should have some sort of systems in place for that. Enabler 2, educate, train, engage in public awareness campaigns, undertake research. And enabler 3, ensure that there is funding enough for certain things, for the programs. So the funding talks to each of those KPIs above. All the enablers speak to each of them, but funding to be able to respond to disasters or for operational and capital needs relative to risk reduction. KPI 1 then says your integrated institutional arrangement. I'll talk about ward level again because it flows from there. You have to create capacity. So have some sort of disaster management center from which all your assessments and programs can be managed. Employ persons to undertake those tasks. They should be have specialist capacity or generalist capacity. Have resources in place, your technical infrastructure, communication hub for emergency. So it says create a center from which disaster management activities can be activated. What have we got? We have a big disaster management center. This is a picture, and I use it particularly just to indicate how collaboration works and coordination. So this is the disaster operation center. The people involved there are from Brazil, and they came to us during World Cup. We were doing a handover and an education to them as how we managed the World Cup. But that was the platform for where we launched coordinated response and operations within the city. It has now changed in line with national imperatives to have a 24/7 fusion center, and it's mimicking what's happening at national. So we are the only municipality sort of in test phase to see how a fusion center works. It was launched by the Minister of Police and the Commissioner of Police, mainly to look at day-to-day operations more from a security aspect. KPA 2 says, understand what's going on in your area. What can go wrong? So undertake a risk assessment. And your risk assessment must look at what has happened previously. What's the history of your area? How likely are things to have, or is it probable that certain hazards can befall the city? How often can have they happened previously, or are they, from your research, probably going to happen? So if we take, for example, we're a coastal city, we're subject to rainy season storms, and then add climate change into that. So we'd say to Dr. Sean O'Donoghue and his climate change people, can you undertake some sort of predictions to say, going forward, what are storms going to look like? So they will give us information on that. What's the impact of that particular hazard or hazards on our municipality? And how likely are these things to happen? So that's the information that goes into the risk assessment, looking at what's on the ground and the people, and then saying, well, we have to understand your risk ultimately. So these are the hazards that can befall your municipality. Your population is very vulnerable because they below the poverty line, or land usage is not very good. And in addition to that, your capacity level is at X. So let's put the sums together, and there it is. We crunch the numbers and we come up with a number that says your risk factor is very high, it's medium, or it's low. So that comes through in a risk assessment. So a risk assessment is knowing what possibly can go wrong in a particular geographic space, and then your planning happens from there. What Dr. Ian Davis says applies quite nicely to risk assessment. So if you try to implement programs and projects without knowing what possibly can go wrong and the impact of that, then it makes no sense. So we're planning for a host of hazards. Now, these are not necessarily our pictures, obviously, but can this happen to us? And we might say yes or no, probably not. And what's the likelihood, and so those measures come in. We know that we are, as a coastal city, are affected mainly by heavy rain and wind and meteorological activity, but we haven't had one. We know that we have tremors, but we haven't had an earthquake, and yet we are on a fault line. So it's something that we have to factor in as well, but say what's the likelihood and what's the probability and what's the history, and marry that, put that all into the pot. So we have undertaken already in the city a risk assessment in 2013, a citywide risk assessment, and it should have covered from end to end and a proper study of what's on the ground and how that can impact upon the environment and the community. So all that goes in, and the risk assessment then was concluded by 2016. Is it by all means, put on the shelf then and said, we've got our risk assessment, we don't have to do anything more? No, we still undertake, because the city is dynamic, it's developing all the time, so constant risk assessments have to be done. And so that's why in that first KPA, you saw ward-based. We go into wards and conduct what is called community risk assessments, understanding what the community thinks can go wrong, and based on their experience, what the impacts have been. So for you, as I say, you might have done the risk assessment and you have programs in place, but one must still be prepared for natural or industrial events or disasters. We saw what happened now in the last while, the how widespread it was, and the ability to respond to that. Even though if you had all the response mechanisms in place, the impact doesn't necessarily respect that and say, well, because you have your response mechanisms in place, we will only affect you a little. But so your response mechanisms come in after. It's the preparedness which is important. KPA 3 then looks at risk reduction. So remember, we have looked at institutional capacity, undertake a risk assessment, now have programs in place for risk reduction. The bubbles indicate all the programs that we are involved in, and not only limited to that, but there are others as well. So we have presence in each of these and running those programs. Part of the education to then ensure that we are at a better level of preparedness. Now that means even if we take, for example, the South Durban Basin, a big industrial zone, in which we had asked the risk assessors to focus on particularly, we have to roll out programs that say to the community, when things go pop, this is our response. We initiated that, but we'll talk more about it again later. We initiated that. We've been sidelined, particularly because of the disaster response, but it's something that we have to pick up in each community, not only in the South Durban Basin, but across the board where people are affected by any sort of hazard. We need to be engaging with them and saying, what's a response plan for the particular area? The fourth KPA then talks of response and recovery. So ensure that we have the ability to manage incidents. As I've been mentioning, disaster management is everybody's business. It's the person on the street. It's the person who's built an informal dwelling somewhere. It's the person living in the big mansion. It's business. It's the economic sector. It's across the board. Everyone is engaged in disaster management, or should be. In response, we have operational. So a motor vehicle accident, for example, is an operational response. We call it the bronze level of command, where the Metro Police and probably the ambulance services might respond to deal with that, a simple incident. If the vehicles involved in that accident are a little now more onerous, so we talk about it's a multi-vehicle pileup, and involved in that were some trucks carrying toxic materials on board. So a silver level of command, the tactical response, comes in where we're dealing with the incident, but there needs to be some sort of coordination on site at joint operations level to manage that. They then say, whoa, These two trucks with hazardous materials have now breached. They're leaking. It's going to impact on the nearby community. So we have to undertake evacuation measures and put in place quick plans to coordinate that. The gold level, the strategic level of command kicks in, and it's looking at where do we evacuate people to? How do we hold them there? What do we give to them for the time that they're going to be there? So moving people from an area of danger into an area of relative safety, while the reduction of the incident is taking place at silver and bronze levels of command. So now we have a more strategic involvement in that, and that's where the disaster operations come in. So we're looking at a much bigger incident with the propensity of escalation and in terms of impact and time. Just some details there on where fire and metro police are contacted. So response and recovery doesn't only deal with your emergency services, but it covers a host of it's the engineering sector, it's the water sector, it's health, so everyone is involved in that as well. The mandate of disaster management then is to serve as the coordinators of response. So this is why you see the conductor, the image of a conductor conducting an orchestra. So everyone has a role to play in a symphony. They have their own sheet of music in front of them, and they know when to come in and what to do. So that's essentially the national response of or function of disaster management. A disaster operations center, we call that a DOC. It becomes operational during disasters, any serious emergency incidents, even events. So Comrades Marathon, we should be managing from our DOC. And the Amashova, the impact on the city is bigger, so we can manage those from there. And it's got the necessary infrastructure, and you saw the images earlier of what we have in place. We have also, and this is the level 2 plan now, after our assessment has been done, the risk assessment, and then you start to look at the risk reduction programs. A level 2 disaster management plan says this is how, it's a policy document, firstly, and a response management document, which then says the metro has this document, which then tells us what we should be doing relative to disaster management and risk reduction. And in addition to that, when there is an incident, this is how the city responds. This is how the metro responds to that incident. And it tasks all its role players. So all the musicians in the orchestra know what their role is, and then they have to continue to develop. And so their contribution to the symphony is harmonious and effective and on time. So each of the sectors, each of the departments then is given that responsibility. So multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional coordination, managing crises or novel events. So the plan it's been ratified, it's gone through, it's reviewed annually, and it details exactly how the city responds. So it also, as I say, it's a policy document, establishes directives for risk reduction initiatives and strategic management coordination. So how from the top level down do we manage incidents? And therefore it's a broad framework within which disaster management planning and in respect of the act it takes place. So it gives direction to how the city deals with disaster management. Let's talk quickly the enablers now of the framework. This one talks about information management. So we need to have a communication center. Where do we report incidents to? Where do we report incidents? The number given earlier indicates that we have a control room, an American 911 in the city. We have to be able to communicate with the public. We should have in our information database history and of incidents, all the risk assessments, ward-based and citywide, event management, all that goes into your information management system, which allows you then the ability to communicate. And if we want to go and find out history of what's happened in the last year, how many storms have we had that were of large impact over the last 10 years, we can go back in our records and pull those out. The municipal adaptation planning, climate change might say to us, We need information relative to how many people were affected. Human settlements might ask information. We can then go back into our database and provide that. That's information management. Education and training and public awareness. The object is that you get people to be self-reliant and resilient by educating them on what might be, what can be, what's the impact, what should you do, what shouldn't you do, and so you train people up, you educate them through public awareness programs. Lots of let's call it the first world countries actually have training courses where people register and go and do a public course, and it's ticked and it's part of a CV, for example. We need to get to that level as well. And then I talked about funding. Now, funding for management, for constant rollout of the full disaster management package. But in addition to that, and I think we all heard of the 1 billion rand that was coming to us or being made available for when the disaster was declared. But the Act says clearly that we need to have not a slush fund, a contingency fund from which we will draw to respond to major emergencies, stroke disasters. So the framework is clear on that, and the Act is clear that we need to have some money in place to respond. What are we seeing currently? That our budgets are being diverted for response. Now, the next few slides, then I'm going to dwell on what we saw in April and May and the declared disaster from that. So, a stats summary. The total fatalities for the impact, for the floods, 417. Missing people is missing. Sorry, missing people should read as 60 people. What are we saying? That certain people, their bodies have just not been found. So they're buried under mudslides of sand and rock and debris, and nobody knows where they are. They're thinking about it, and we haven't closed off that chapter of search and rescue. Families contact us and say to us, we believe our loved one is here. We try and activate the necessary tools and machinery to see if we can find people who are buried under mudslides. Throughout the metro, 86 wards of 111 reported damage. The total dwellings affected registering at 26,800, partially damaged at 483, and totally damaged at 26,367. And then the breakdown at the bottom of the number of children, adults, and the total number of people who've reported as affected. And then just some images of what we saw. So if one drives through now, you will see that lots of the areas have been repaired already and cleaned. So the rehabilitation phase kicked in quite quickly, so to get things back to normal. One of the problems that we see, if we look at, a lot of impact occurred in the inner west area. And we then have got an understanding, if we didn't have before, of the power of water. And unfortunately, this poor privately owned home very badly impacted because it's probably within the 1 in 100 year flood line. And we see then how the land is damaged around that. Just more images of damage. And I won't speak to them. I think the images do speak for themselves, how also industry was affected. So what we did notice was the number of landslides that occurred. This is in the Pinetown area, and we see how where water, to the image on the right, water running over the surface, then scurries the tarred surface and little below. So you're macadamizing, which is road building, and then your road is damaged in that way, or it collapses completely. One of the problems was, in which the contributory factor, particularly to the damage, was because we were for a long period of time in the La Nina effect. We have El Nino, which is hotter, dry conditions, La Nina, rainy, wet conditions. So the soil subsurface was very muddy because the water table, with all the water we had before the April and May rains, rose fairly high. And then that coming down from the skies, when the two mix, the soil becomes very soft and muddy underneath and starts to then move. It can then, as you see in the image, the water pipe burst, just by slight movement of the subterranean, cause a problem. A water pipe burst, unbeknown to anyone, and muddies the soil even more, and then leads to the wash away. So your heavier, stronger surface then gives way, or the undersurface gives way to the heavier surface above. And we don't see what's happening underground quite often. So that's half the cause of the landslides that we did see. And so people living close to water courses, in the drier times, it's a little stream which one can step over in one little hop. But when the rain comes down from particularly the higher elevations and then runs down, we see then what damage it can cause. I've been amazed at the number of rocks that we have in the metro, which have all been unearthed suddenly. The image to the left is in the Avoca area, the sewer works, the pipeline that goes through there. You see how that was damaged because of land movement. And running next to it was a connecting road. One couldn't drive along there for the stench. That's the Umhlangan area. Just more images and broken pipes, substations which were underwater. And then we all saw what happened down south with the Umlaas interchange firstly being affected. And then the subsequent flooding down to the south at Toyota. The presidential house was affected. You see the golf course holding a lot of water. This is just to the north of the Moses Mabhida Stadium. One of the challenges is if the Umgeni River rose much higher than it did, if it reaches 2 meters, 2.5 meters, the water could flow through that golf course and the city center could be impacted. We saw that this is in Ward 7 on the left-hand side, Shongweni, a similar case in the Ntuzuma area where the road was just completely divided, a chasm between, because the water needed a way out. And then to the right is Glen Ashley. So it spared nobody on its path. So what did happen then, and I talked about evacuation being a movement of people from an area of danger to an area of relative safety, because people's homes were destroyed partially or totally. We had to move people into care centers. So the rule of thumb is that we open council halls and move people into those spaces where they can find shelter and then provide them with the necessary. So what do we give? The number of care centers was at 103. It's come down to 71, but there's been some movement. We've got it at around about 80 at the moment. The number in those care centers of displaced people, 5,811 as of the 18th of August, but that number fluctuates anything over 6,000 and back again. People move back and forth to where they stayed, firstly to protect property, and then also just to, if they feel unsafe, to come back to an area of safety. Community halls and some churches were involved. People were fed. So those are all the services they received and are still receiving in those care centers. I'll speak about feeding in a short while. To the column, the table in blue indicates the wards that were affected and where exactly they were. Let's just talk about the meals. Initially, we were able to provide, using NGOs, lots of hot meals to the displaced people in care centers. Of course, the well is not that deep. And so after a while that ran out. So of the donations that we had, we gave people dry rations in order for them to prepare their own meals in the different care centers. Again, that has dried up. And so council has had to, then the city manager has signed an extension of funding for that for 1 month, so that those people still in the community halls might be fed still. There's another challenge, that how long is a temporary care center? We can discuss that, I'm sure, under questioning. So water tanks, JoJo tanks, all these were provided to ensure that the people were comfortable, at least in those care centers, in those halls. Now you're talking about some halls with 4 families, other halls with 260 people in. It's not the ideal place to be, and that's what has to be temporary. These slides just talk about some of the assistance that has been given, and so I'm not going to dwell on those. So you see the Section 36 contract number now to extend that. Still again similar. Oh, those seem to be duplicated. Now we have to decant those care centers, so we have to think of an exit strategy. And you see number 6 is the name given to the operation then to decant the halls, to move people out from the halls into either temporary or permanent accommodation. So this now falls under the discipline of human settlements. The idea is then allocation of houses, either temporary residential units, which the national government is assisting us with, or giving people building material to go back to where they came from, if it's safe to do so, and then reconstruct homes there, even if it's temporary, but to get out of the halls. Or BNG, breaking new ground, is development then of your low-cost housing again, and to move people into that. People want to be moved into more permanent houses than temporary. And so an agenda kicks in that they want to delay the moving out of the hall. So these are just some of the challenges. Churches have given us time frames. We've had to move people out. Municipal services, we paying for electricity and water and sanitation, so that becomes a challenge to us as well. The other thing I did mention is that people don't want to move out, so they use it as an agenda to get as much out of the situation as they can. So what currently is happening through human settlements, working with provincial and national government, is to identify land. So we have to look for sites where we can then roll out the supply of the TRUs. So 8 sites have been with completed layouts. We can get 1,074 dwellings placed there quickly. This is the idea now. So we're looking at parcels of land, and there are 8 of them. I just put in 2 for our reference. And you see the breakdown. So it's a process. It's not an immediate. If we go and acquire land, for example, from the sugar industry, we still have to then prepare that land, flatten it, terrace it, and do whatever's necessary, roll out the necessary infrastructure in order to develop some sort of communal living on those parcels. So it's not a quick process. Let's talk water. The slide indicates the breakdown according to region. So in the Inner West region, during the storm, we had come down to 30%. The repair over time now is at 80 and up to 90%. So it keeps growing. In the Outer West region, and everything is indicated on the slide. The North still creates a problem for us, largely because the water purification works was knocked out. And so that is a major project, and we know that people have been told 2023. Now, if you look at the top image and you see the water pipelines there, so in order to get the reticulation going again, the ground has to be rehabilitated before the infrastructure is reconnected and made good so that supply can happen. So this is some of the problems that we were encountering. This is the Reservoir Hills reservoir. There was a landslide there as well, which came right up against where we in the city get most of our purified water. So there are challenges to the bulk infrastructure. Already repairs in place, trying to get water connected. So just an image there. We have all probably seen then the water rationing schedule, and in order to ensure that there is some semblance of supply across, particularly in the north, a water rationing schedule had to be created and publicized, and people then work around that until such time as the supply is restored completely, and there's a big focus to get that going again. We've talked then the water rationing, and then resettlement of communities later. So just some of the work that has is being done and has been done already. Financial considerations, we're talking in excess of 5 billion rand, the cost implication of the April and May impact. May I just indicate one thing, and it's the one in red, the block in red. Government does not carry a public liability for property. So it's responsible for when council infrastructure or resources cause damage. So a staff member who might have done something, a council vehicle driven by a council member which might have crashed into a property. If we have a surge in electricity and all one's appliances blow, then one can claim against council through the insurance. But we have been told the government does not carry a self-insurance reserve for the public. It has for its own infrastructure, but it is not liable then to come onto my property and rehabilitate the bank which has slid because of the heavy rain that we had. That is personal insurance cover, and each of us should have, as we can afford, some sort of insurance to cover such eventualities. The problem is that we know with people below the poverty line cannot afford. So going forward, some thinking has to happen about how do we work with the insurance industry to have some measure of cover to even public space or private space where they cannot afford to do so. So I leave it there. I'm at the end of the presentation, and just by correction, Dr. Sean, Senior Coordinator, not Senior Manager. I thank you all.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. It was an incredibly broad-ranging and interesting presentation. Before and lots of cheers from everyone in of the over 150 participants. So this is a fantastic amount of interest in today's seminar. Before I open up for questions of clarity on the presentation itself, I just want to ask everyone to please have a look in the chat, and Janice has just posted the link to the attendance register. Please make sure that you register for this event there, so that we can have a good idea of who's joined, and it's incredible turnout, as I said. Okay, so as I've said in the chat earlier as well, we'll do questions of clarity on the presentation here, and then Professor Cathy Sutherland will present. We'll do the same for Cathy, and then the last half an hour to 50 minutes will be a real detailed facilitated discussion, and we'll be looking at things like, how does the city prepare for such disasters through risk reduction? How do we respond during events and then post events, and then even hopefully touching on issues of loss and damage as well, because we know that's going to be incredibly important as climate change bites into our future. So Alana, I see your hand is up. Earlier we had a hand from Tanisha, so perhaps I'll give Tanisha. No, sorry, it was somebody else. It was okay. I can't see the hand now, but Alana, please. So whoever it was, please put your hand up again. But for now, can we have Alana? Please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're from, and then please ask your question.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the great presentation. I'm Alana Rebello. I'm a senior researcher at the Agricultural Research Council based in Hilton from February this year, so relatively new to the catchment, but I've done some hydrological modeling work in the catchment in the past, so I'm a little bit familiar with it. My question of clarity is just around one of the last slides where it was mentioned that there was one sentence about building back better and restoring community order. And I just wanted to have some clarity on what that meant, because it was one of the concerns that I had looking through the presentation and driving through this area myself, noticing all the reconstruction of bridges and so on. And I was wondering, to what extent is it business as usual in the same old civil engineering designs? And to what extent are we starting to learn and build with nature? and improve our design so that we don't have to just rebuild every time we have a disaster like this. So yeah, just some clarity on that perhaps. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alana. Malcolm, if it's all right, there's 3 people asking questions. We'll take a group of 3. I think that'll be a little bit more time efficient. So we'll give Ngeba and then Kira a chance to ask respectively, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Ngeba Gerald Kwela from the Western Cape Disaster Management, responsible for disaster mitigation. My question or my comment actually, but it might sound like a question, is that I first thank you for a very impressive, more detailed presentation. But in the presentation, I find out that you did speak about early warnings and the integration of risk assessments throughout the whole planning or the whole continuum, as you mentioned it. But I do feel that maybe a more thorough research still needs to be done for early warnings, because losing 400 plus 400 lives, it shows a very huge gap in terms of the people on the ground, how effective the early warnings are on the ground, because that's the main purpose of early warnings. So I do think that maybe you have a take on it to say that you do have a contingency plan of a strategy that can actually be utilized to ensure that early warnings are actually received well in advance by the people on the ground, especially the poor communities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ngeba. And we actually have some good thoughts on that as well. I'm sure Professor Cathy Sutherland will touch on that in her presentation. And then finally, in this batch, Kira.
Thanks very much, Sean and Malcolm. I appreciate that. And forgive me for being a little bit opportunistic, but I would really appreciate it, and I'm not sure whether to contact both of you directly or perhaps you could advise who we could reach out to. I'm speaking now just as a rough sort of or loose coalition of Durban organizations, civil society organizations, some of whom, like Abishlali, have very much been affected on the ground. We have tried to reach out to senior leadership to ask for a meeting on this exact issue, to say we can see that this was so devastating and that even the municipality in some sense has battled to be able to respond to this. And we'd like to get into a constructive engagement, some sort of participation where we can help communities at a very local level start to plan disaster management processes, so that when something like this happens again, and we know with climate change we can expect that, people have a sense where to go, who to reach out to, who in their community has got skills they can offer. And so my request, I think, to both of you is who can I contact with around this? This coalition is actually meeting tomorrow evening, and I'm happy to send you that invite. There's a small working group who is directly thinking about disaster management, but we would prefer to do that with the municipality. It's just been a little bit tricky to get a response. So maybe you can assist us with that. Thanks very much.
No, thanks very much, Kira. Malcolm, we have 3 questions. I'm going to ask you to please try to keep your answers quite concise, because we've got 12 minutes left before we need Cathy to start presenting. And if you do that, then we can take the further 3 questions after that from Bongani, Councillor Jeff Pullen, welcome, Councillor, and Lorata Kubone. Over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you. So I hope we can see the image, the graphic I've projected now.
We can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So that graphic talks to what happens. It's called the disaster management continuum. So you can start at anywhere basically, but let's start at the disaster impact. And then the phases thereafter in your post-disaster recovery phase, your relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction phases kick in. Now, for the first question from Ilana, then Build Back Better. This is where perhaps the challenge comes in. Are we doing more of the same again? But it presumes before the reconstruction phase kicks in that your mitigation should be talking already at this point to the reconstruction and informing it. So your multidisciplinary task team for reconstruction should be having a big melting pot discussion of how do we improve. And that happens, it takes you to a higher level of mitigation, and then so two types of mitigation: non-structural mitigation and structural mitigation. So your structural is your build environment and that, and your non-structural is your awareness and getting people to a better understanding of risk and how to respond to that, and takes you to then a higher level of preparedness. I apologize that because it's a copied image, it doesn't, the text is not too clear. So your pre-disaster risk reduction phase kicks in, and it comes from there and into that, so that when this happens again, you're at a better level. And take the Japanese, by example, of buildings that dance to tremors and earthquakes. We've got to get to that kind of situation again as well, taking into account what our hazards are and the risk impact. So I share that. In terms of early warnings, and never mentioned that, one can also put out lots of early warnings timeously and with good content, but it depends what's on the ground already. So if your land use now, if we think that in eThekwini we've got more than 600 informal settlements, when you then consider that that type of habitation just breeds vulnerability, then no matter how effective the warnings are, the impact of the hazard can be devastating. So it's not that the early warning, the EWS hasn't gone out, it's what's already on the ground and your levels of vulnerability, your land use, your resources, all of that in place. In addition, eThekwini is built on very slopy ground, so we rise quickly from the coastline, and so our terrain is not flat. Hence, we don't have standing water flooding, we have flash flooding, and that causes more damage than standing water, I would argue. For us, the problem was that the impact was so widespread and even beyond our boundaries, our municipal boundaries, into other municipalities, and all because of what went before in terms of the rainfall and the La Nina effect. And so we had two Hungarian professors who asked us to take them to the landslide. And we said, well, okay, which one do you want to go to? They said, no, exactly where the landslide was. But if you look through the municipality, myriads of landslides all over, which caused the damage. In terms of then the Kiera's question in looking at how to work together, I would suggest this needs maybe even to be engaged at the office of the mayor and the municipal manager, so that a variety of disciplines are engaged in that. We're talking disaster management, we're talking the preparedness basically, and lessening of impact, mitigating impacts upon the informal sector of housing, but there's lots of people, lots of sectors and departments who have engagement in that. So I would suggest that it's rather taken at a much higher level than plugged in only at disaster management, so that then we have a far more integrated approach to what you're raising. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. And on that last point, I think maybe we can take that forward to the discussion point, because I think that's a very good and necessary idea, is that there's some convening body at a high level that can take up these discussions. So we'll give Bongani Mthembu, then Councillor Jeff Pullen, and then Lorato opportunity to ask their questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, for the opportunity. And yeah, thanks, Malcolm, for that presentation. As much as we feel that there's still a lot that needs to be done by the disaster management unit. So I think maybe I've been covered on the previous speakers, but now I also like to raise this concern that has been raised by us on numerous occasions, the issue of the container depots, especially if you were to look at the container depot at the corner of Prospecting Road in Isipingo and Road R102. There's one on the left and there's one on the right, especially the one on the right next to the N2 highway. That container depot was built in a wetland, and that on its own, we have raised this concern, I think somewhere around 2019, you can correct me, Malcolm, when we actually met at your offices. We spoke about these mushrooming container depots, and especially the environmental impact they have. And basically, you know, we're not really taken seriously because they're still operating, they're making money, and our city does not take responsibility to make sure that they hold whomever the responsible company is accountable. And this is totally unacceptable. How can you actually build on a wetland? That's why we suffer the consequences of those, the freeway being flooded because someone just decided to open a business on a wetland. So this is totally unacceptable. Hopefully,
Thanks, Bongani. I think we've got your questions. We're short of time. Councillor Pullen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sean and Malcolm. Just an observation, much of the damage to infrastructure was because we have cluttered rivers and streams. In fact, our water courses are full of junk. Now they're full of dead trees and branches, but that causes huge problems because it creates dams. Our stormwaters were also, a lot of them are blocked, and that's because we as human beings are useless, and we just throw our cans out of the window. It goes into the stormwater and blocks the drain. In fact, the trapped water did more damage than anything else. And my suggestion is that we, as a city, keep our water courses clear, because then the water can get away. Then we don't have this problem of them washing the roads away and things like that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Councillor Pullen, and I'm sure we'll discuss the transformative river management program in the discussion session as well. Lerato.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sean, for the opportunity, and Malcolm, thank you for the presentation. I'm Lerato from Environmental Health. I'm sorry if I'm going to take you back. I had a little bit of a glitch with my network. I didn't get that. I didn't get exactly what is the current position of the council with regards to communities that are still in shelters, especially in terms of provision of basic services. I just got a little bit where he was talking about people having to move out because of the definition of what temporal is. If it's okay, can Malcolm please just go back to that slide again, even if it's just to summarize. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks, Lerato, and I'm sure Malcolm would be happy to. Over to you, Malcolm.
Okay, I'm just calling up the presentation again, which was here. Okay, so essentially, if I may start at the bottom, and then I'll go to Councillor Jeff Pullen and then Mongani thereafter. Because I'm dealing with this, the plan is to decant the centres. It was a media question which I had to reply to yesterday. How long is temporary? Well, you see, this is where the reconstruction phase kicks in, and that has to happen very quickly. But if one rushes it, then you're back to what Ilana raised about building back better, but you're doing exactly the same thing. So we cannot send people to where they were evacuated from, because that land, the land itself was damaged. So getting the land parcels, doing all the necessary in terms of geological surveys, and that's the time-consuming process. So we had hoped by 3 months, 4 months, people would be out of the centres. Unfortunately, that's not what is. And even in trying to encourage people by providing building material, you see number 4 on the slide there, providing building material to the people. They don't want that, because also there's, I mentioned much earlier on, an agenda. I want the best out of this. So I'm, in a sense, going to milk the system. I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's an opportunity. So people realize that, and so there's an agenda that kicks in. Councillor Pullen's point is absolutely clear, and there was a program, and I'll have to refer to the correct department to find out, but in the dry season there was a program to clear water courses and of unnecessary debris, stormwater drains, and all that kind of thing in our winter months, so that come the rain season, the runoff is facilitated far easier. Again, disaster management is everybody's business, and it means that I, as Mr. Citizen, should be doing the right thing and not dumping my litter in a watercourse. We see it constantly around informal settlements where there's a little stream running. If you go through there, the water backs up because of the litter, because it becomes the area in which to discard litter. So we all have a big responsibility in that, not only council. Council cannot be running around because the community is doing the wrong thing, and so we spending unnecessarily on what shouldn't be done in the first place. At Bongani, sorry, Councillor Jeff, also one must acknowledge the amount of debris that was brought down in the water. If you go to Ntuzuma, the main access route, the engineering culvert underneath is still sound where the water runs through on a daily basis. But because of the debris that was brought down the water course, that blocked that up and backed the water up about three stories high, and then wiped through the road completely in that chasm I was talking about. It's also part of the course when there's heavy rains and flooding. At Bongani, the old saying, disasters cause development and development causes disasters. That container depot in a wetland, it's economically beneficial to someone or people or a group, and one doesn't consider what will happen when a storm comes in 75 years' time. So these things also have to be thought of, and I think a lot of thinking is going into what is happening in the South Durban Basin, and I'm not privy to that. I've seen some information on it, but I know there's a lot of thinking going into what's happening in the South Durban Basin right now. Thank you, Dr. Shaw.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks both. Those first two questions from Bongani and Councillor Pullen relate very much to catchment management, making sure we have enough ecological infrastructure to absorb maybe not rainfall of this magnitude, but certainly of a smaller magnitude rainfalls, and lessen the impacts that they have. So we'll take that up as a discussion point at the end after Professor Cathy Sutherland presents, because she's going to add more sort of information to this topic. So with that, thanks very much for your wonderful presentation, Malcolm, and for dealing with the questions of clarity. But now we'll hand over to Professor Cathy Sutherland, and I see Cathy, you're sharing your screen. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sean. And can you hear me correctly?
Yes, we can, and we can see your screen.
Okay,
thanks. If you put it on presentation mode, please.
Yes. Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak today. And in this presentation that I'm going to do on the social dimensions of the Durban floods, where I'll be looking both at the April 2022 floods, but also looking back in time from what we learned from the April 2019 floods, I must recognize that this work is not my work alone. It is also the work of officials from the municipality, Jeff Tooley, Sean O'Donoghue, and Smiso Bengu, who are part of this seminar, and also the communities that I work in, most particularly the Quarry Road West Informal Settlement Community, that has taught us an enormous amount about how we deal with and respond to these floods, as well as members of the Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project, which has been ongoing for the last 9 years, and through which we've learned many of these lessons. So I think Malcolm's given an overview of the floods. Of course, what we must recognize is that the floods in 2022 were 30% of the mean annual rainfall. So it was a very intensive rainfall event. And of course, there was extensive loss of life, as we'd heard, houses damaged, but also most importantly, land lost. And that really is the implication for people living in informal settlements, because not only do they lose their houses, but they use their land. And we see the flooding of roads, damage to infrastructure, all of the things that Malcolm's talked about. But what this leads to is a major social disruption to the everyday life of citizens. And that's particularly for the poor and the vulnerable. But in fact, in this flood, it had citywide impact. And so across the board, people's lives were disrupted by these floods. When we look at what causes a disaster, we can think about the risk being a product of the hazard, which was the rainfall event, and of course the vulnerability or context within which that event happened. And if you look at Raymond Schultz's work, interestingly, he has said that the rainfall event in April 2022 wasn't significantly high if you compare it to other events throughout the city's history. So we need to ask questions about why this rainfall event manifested itself in the way that it created a disaster. We also need to look at the value of knowledge produced by social and environmental scientists in our city and citizens. And that's a large part of the work that we do collectively with Sean and Simiso and Jeff across the city and within the Palmy Rehabilitation Project, is that we're drawing on both specialist and experiential knowledge of citizens as well to understand how we can adapt and respond to these kind of climate change events. And then we need to think about how do we learn, what do we learn from, and how do we transfer this knowledge to the disaster risk reduction processes that Malcolm has spoken about. So I've been thinking long and hard about what I should present in the seminar today, because there's so many lessons to be learned. And I must tell you that we are still learning from the floods of April 2022. It was a very traumatic event, very significant in our city. And so these are just really early ideas that I've had and in working with other groups of people about what we could focus on. But this is by no means comprehensive, and there's still a lot of learning and understanding that needs to take place. So what I thought I would talk about today were the sort of three standout things for me in this early sort of understanding of the flood event. And one is the value of community-based flood early warning systems. Two is this idea that we need to build geographic literacy and knowledge across cities, and we need to perhaps think of how we put that into risk profiles at the settlement or local scale. So not dealing with the citywide scale, but working at a more localized scale. And then to understand some of the social-political challenges that come out of our response to disaster. So what I'll focus on today is a more of a river case study and focus on the flooding in relation to rivers, because that's a large proportion of the work that I do. But I'm also engaged in work in the peri-urban areas of our city where a lot of the landslides happened. And of course, these landslides and the extent of the landslides was a major learning for us in the recent floods, because that was really extensive and in a way relatively new to have so many landslides across such a large area of the city. So in thinking about this, what I thought about was to look at the idea of community-based flood early warning systems and to look at the theory around that. And it's quite interesting because when you look at community-based flood early warning systems, it's not only about early warnings to floods, which is really critically important, but it's also about our response capability. So it's a really useful framework that helps us understand what risk knowledge we need, what are the elements at risk, what are our levels of vulnerability, how do we monitor things that are happening like rainfall, river levels and warning decisions, how do we communicate those decisions through different mechanisms and forms. And then when an event happens, how do we deal with it immediately through evacuation, search and rescue, relief goods, but then how do we deal with it in the longer term? And the reason I've put the South African flag here is where I am proudly South African, is that I think one of the contributions we can make, and certainly from Durban, that's our learned experience, is that we really understand the importance of context and different contexts in shaping what this risk knowledge needs to be and then how this warning system plays out. So if you look at the literature on community-based flood early warning system, it speaks a lot about being people-centered, being timely, being very simple, and also relying on low-cost technology so that it can be operated by people on the ground. And so that's part of a process that we've developed in the city over the last 8 years to try and understand how we can respond to climate change or adapt to climate change using these localized multi-actor processes that draw on local community knowledge. Of course, with early warnings, it's always tricky because sometimes people don't respond to those warnings. So, for example, the SAWS warnings might go out on SMSs across the municipality, but people don't always respond to it because they think it's a case of crying wolf. It might be false news. We know how much false news is distributed. They doubt the credibility of that. There's misunderstanding or lack of knowledge or mistrust. And so sometimes those early warning systems don't take hold. But as I'll show you in the example that we've, and the case study that we've worked on, when you actually build relationships between people, early warning systems can be very, very powerful in what they can do. Of course, communities are always weighing up risks, and particularly in informal settlements, the idea of evacuating from away from your home is very high risk for those community members because they know then that they can lose possession. So I know in the case of Quarry Road informal settlement, people that vacated their houses early actually had other people robbing from their houses. And so there's a lot of resistance for people to actually leave their site where they live and their possessions because they feel that they need to protect it. One of the biggest learnings we've got from the work that we've done is that you've got to look at the role of civil society organizations and research institutions, because in building these relationships between citizens and the state, which is critical in responding to this kind of risk, you really need intermediaries or actors who can act as bridges. So either they civil society organizations, research institutions, churches, that actually act as the intermediary between the state and citizens and enable this response to happen. And one of the other important lessons we've learned through our research is that the co-production of knowledge of multiple actors is absolutely critical to embed into the system. So I looked at some examples of community-based flood early warning systems in the Hindu Kush region, in the Himalaya region, where these are very well developed. And you'll see this example here represents how early flood warning systems might work, but you can see the emphasis of this diagram is very much on technology. So data acquisition units, a water level sensor, GIS, remote access messaging system, a data upload unit. So most of it is focused on the kind of technical aspects of how you send this information downstream on a river. But what's important is that actually the social dimensions of these flood warning systems is just as important as the technical interventions. And I think that's where in the example we've got from Durban, we've been able to really enhance those social components. And that's why this early flood warning system we developed worked relatively well. So we've got all the technical components that are established, but the collaboration is required in establishing these social components that enable the communication of risk, the preparedness to respond, and also the response capabilities. And so we've got to learn much more along this whole set of elements to try and improve how we do this flood warning. If you look at other case studies from around the world, again, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, they focus on community-centered initiatives and really knowing the local environment and being aware of the capacities of people in that local environment. And both in the Hindu Kush region, we saw it in the floods in the UK too, on papers done on that, the community is always the first response to a disaster. So how do you build the capabilities and the knowledge of the community? When you have top-down and highly technical responses, they often ignore these contextual factors or the vulnerability of communities, and so that disaster response doesn't always work very well. There's also case studies from Nigeria where they've used also low-cost community-based real-time flood warning systems and low-cost devices to try and alert communities about floods. In Malawi, there's an interesting case study which is focused on the response of the government for early flood warning systems, and then community-based civil society organizations and faith-based organizations. But what's interesting in the Malawi case study is that these two systems are not well integrated. So the government's doing one thing and these community-based organizations are doing another. And I think that's the other successful learning from Durban, because we've got an integration of community-based and government responses. So when we think about how we deal with disasters, what we need to also see is the bigger picture of what happens in city management or sustainable city management. And what's really important is that you'll see in this presentation that the work that we've been able to do around flood responses in 2019 and 2022 didn't come as a focus on flood response. It actually emerged out of our river rehabilitation project. So this emphasizes the real critical importance of Durban's transformative riverine management program, because all of the work that we've done on river rehabilitation, and here we have focused on the Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project, has led us to the kind of learning that has enabled us to do the kind of disaster risk management that we need to do. And the reason that that works is because these river rehabilitation projects reveal a more open and co-produced form of planning, which includes the knowledge and practices of multiple actors, all kinds of catchment planners from both within and outside of the state, that work together to try and create these inclusive approaches, looking at ecological, hydrological, social, economic, environmental, political relationships, all these relationships dealing with issues in the catchment, which then enable us to develop particular kind of responses. And in this case, we're looking at the impact of the Durban floods. How do we do disaster risk management? How do we adapt to climate change? And so I'm going to speak to you about the community-based flood early warning system that emerged out of this river rehabilitation project that's part of the Transformative Riverine Management Program. And the first step of doing that is we had to first build a governance platform. So we had to build state-citizen relationships, we had to build relationships between municipal sectors, and we had to look at who these intermediaries could be. So this is the picture of the governance platform that was built in the Palmead Catchment Rehabilitation Project, and you can see it involves municipality departments, national government, through their programs have some role to play there, researchers, the Quarry Road West informal settlement community, environmental groups within the Palmead catchment, such as the Palmead River Valley Conservancy, and even the role of global institutions through their funding mechanisms that have all built this governance platform that have enabled us to work together. We've also produced very detailed knowledge on the ground, particularly in the most vulnerable context, which in this case is the Quarry Road West informal settlement. So we've worked there for 9 years with community-based researchers, building up baseline data, doing participatory GIS mapping, participating in Durban's resilience strategy, developing some climate-smart informal settlement handbook ideas, working on the narratives of home, improving sanitation technologies there, and building, as I said, this community-based early flood warning system. So all of this knowledge that we've worked on together has enabled us to do the kinds of things we've done in this disaster risk management. And one of these you can see is a community-based map that was developed in partnership with the community and the university, led by Bashle Mazeka. And here the community actually mapped out the risks in the settlement. There you can see the flood risk of Quarry Road, that the majority of the settlement is in the 1 in 100-year flood line. But the community mapped out other risks in association to the life of an informal settlement in a vulnerable floodplain like this. So this mapping of risk enabled us, and this was done in 2018, to understand how the community themselves were identifying risk spaces in the settlement. We then started to work also with eThekwini municipality through Jeff Tooley and the Fuse system that he had developed. So we had been working at a localized scale trying to manage flood risk, but we were kind of stuck because we needed this higher level knowledge about actually how that flood risk was going to play out. And Jeff and his team were working on the Fuse system that actually had a radar in the Palmead catchment. So they started to use their scientific knowledge and their monitoring of early warning systems through the Fuse system to provide us with information based on their hydraulic models. So they'd done hydraulic models of what would happen in the Palmead River. They had monitoring tools because they have a radar in the catchment. They also use the Pinetown rain gauge and the Palmead stream gauge, and all of this is work that Jeff has done. And because of that, we could then integrate a whole range of knowledge that would help us with our communication plan for flood risk warning in that settlement. So we have this whole network of information from the SAWS weather warnings, which are giving us the initial warning, from Jeff's more localized warnings of flood. And then we have community members and actors in 2 WhatsApp groups, one which is run a WhatsApp group between the university, NGOs and city officials, where we're communicating this initial warnings about flood systems, and then a WhatsApp group with community leaders and the university, and Lee Deeth also has his own WhatsApp group that he uses, where we're communicating the information that's coming in to communities to give them early flood warning. So this is an example of our community-based flood warning system. That's a partnership between all of these groups of actors that I've spoken about. And you can see this is a live example of one of the flood warnings on the 10th of April. So already on that Sunday, Jeff was sending out a notification that there would be high rainfall on the 11th of April. Then you can see that SMISO went down to Quarry Road. We often get live pictures back from community members about what's happening. Jeff was then sending us more information about the high levels of rainfall in Pinetown. And we know that it takes about 40 minutes for that water to flow from Westville down to the Quarry Road West informal settlement. So through this WhatsApp group, in the early parts of the day, these warnings were already beginning to move, and we were communicating that with community members in the settlement. This is much later on in the night when things became really serious, and you can see Jeff gave the warning river level is already at 3 meters at Birdhurst. We need to inform quarry road. Here you can see that I'm communicating with the quarry road community and letting them know the dangers that are there and suggesting to people that the river is going to move a lot. We need to move people away from the river. And so this WhatsApp group is used to communicate and to pass information to community members at the local level. And of course, what happened in this flood, at the time when Nono from Quarry Road was actually sending us this picture of water coming over the bridge, and Jeff and I were trying to understand what had actually happened. That was at 10 o'clock that night. What we didn't realize is that the kind of the worst scenario of what could have happened in the Palmeet River happened in that the lower bridge blocked from the debris and the solid waste. So the bridge was entirely blocked and the river actually changed its course. Because I'd been in the settlement up till 6 o'clock in that evening, going through the community with the Enviro champs, warning people that Jeff had informed us that there were 3 storm cells still to come in the night, and warning people that there were still 3 more storm events anticipated, so they should move their goods, they should start moving out of the settlement. And what happened at 10 o'clock then was that at 6 o'clock, this bridge was still functioning. By 10 o'clock, it had blocked up and the river changed course, and this gouged out this huge hole and removed all of these houses. This area was full of informal houses. Communal ablution block was removed. These cabs were pushed right across the road. It was an absolute disaster, as you can see. But what was amazing about this event is that no lives were lost, other than one poor soul who was killed because of being in contact with illegal electricity and water. So it was remarkable that in this community where such devastation happened, no lives were lost due to flood waters. And the community and all of us working in this project attribute a lot of that to the fact that this early warning system was in place. There was communication on all fronts around the high level of risk, so that when the actual disaster happened, people were on high alert and were able to move out. And one of the community members was telling me the other day, what she believes was really helpful was because there were these very high levels of early warning, most people had been told not to go to sleep at night. So they were all awake, so that when this event happened, and of course, that's one of the real risks of a disaster is when it happens at night. So people hadn't gone to sleep. They were awake still, and the community had been communicating that with them, and therefore they were able to get out. So if we look at this community-based flood warning system, the key learnings from it is that it works across a whole lot of levels. We really draw a lot on the SAWS warnings, and even the idea of the early warnings from SAWS about the El Nino effect and that we had very saturated soils, that there would be much more water in the system, had already alerted us this year to the risks of the Palmeet River. We get the short rain forecasts, which also give us the heads up that something's going to happen. What's also important about this system is it's a local response, and it's been developed over a long period of time. So we've learned a lot. We initially started when Lee Deeth used to send rainfall data warnings from his rain gauge higher up in the catchment, which we then could communicate to communities. Before they all had WhatsApp and Wi-Fi, I would phone community leaders and tell them that the river was rising, and we kind of had worked out locally what the risks were. And interestingly, when I looked at the SAWS weather warnings, we had guesstimated that when the river gets above 40 millimeters, there's a risk of a flood. And in fact, SAWS uses 50 millimeters. So it's interesting comparing this local knowledge with what the SAWS data says. Sean Donahue always helped us because, of course, he gave us the heads up that SAWS can only issue the weather warning. So we can't take responsibility for saying that this kind of weather is going to happen. What we do is we take the knowledge in the system. Jeff gives us very up-to-date and precise communication from the FUSE system. And then collectively, we make decisions about what levels of warning or how we communicate with the community. You can see they send us pictures back as to what's actually happening in the river. So between their knowledge and what we know is going on in the higher level system of weather monitoring, we can then start making decisions about how high the risk level actually is. So this whole partnership has grown over time. It's a very people-intensive system. It's very much at the local level. It involves all these intermediaries and the role of Enviro champs who send out the warnings in the community. But I think through the last few years, and particularly in terms of what happened in this most recent flood, we've learned a lot about how the system can actually work. And we're very interested in thinking about how do we scale this up across the city, and how do we use this case study to do this kind of work elsewhere. Of course, what we've been able to do is combine high-tech and low-tech interventions. And they're very people-oriented methods, as I said. So, of course, it's very people-intensive, but because it's people intensive, it means it can be localized to work on the ground. So we're using these kind of socio-technical solutions and governance platforms to really address early flood warning. And I think it kind of sets Durban apart in learning and experimenting because we've been doing this for so many years. We have to also think about, who are these intermediaries or bridges? How do you set up these middle groups who can play this role to transfer knowledge? Who has the authority to actually speak about the warnings and to give the warnings? I mean, in the case of the 2022 floods, it was a whole combination of data that eventually led, I think, Jeff and myself by 10 o'clock to really, and of course, the community's experience of the flood themselves, for everybody to decide it was really time to get out. And then the major risk was that the community members were saying to us, but where do we go to? And luckily, we knew the context of that area, so we were recommending areas where we knew there was some higher level ground and places of safety, such as the BP garage up the road. But just as that was going on, we hit a period of load shedding. And so we were all losing communication with each other. So, you just realize how these other events actually make the disaster even worse. So the fact that we had load shedding on the night that we had this flood was just beyond measure. And we also realized through this learning that you've got to have these context-specific responses. And then how in an emergency how do you be decisive, and how do you adopt a precautionary approach where you rather err on the side of not keeping people into that space for too long and rather moving them out, but also not putting them at risk all the time of making them scared from too many weather warnings or getting into a situation where it might be perceived as crying wolf. We also need to think about the scale at which we do this. So of course, we're working very much at a localized scale, and I think I would argue for that approach. If you look at other parts of the world, they work on these flood warning systems at a much bigger catchment scale. This is the kind of Pakistan flood warning system. So it's right across the whole catchment that they do that, a massive land area across Pakistan. We are saying in Durban that actually these localized flood warning systems may be the best way to go. So that's the kind of story of the community-based flood warning system that I've just tried to present to you as quickly as I could in this seminar. The other thing that I've learned is that I think we need to look at how we build up risk assessment and risk profiles from neighborhoods. So my experience of this flooding, both here and in the areas where the landslides were, is that I think we need to build what I'm calling geographic knowledge and literacy, both across citizens and the state. We need to understand our landscapes much better again. And we need to understand the geography of our city. So we need to think about different settlement typologies, because in different settlements, we know these are settlement typologies in our city. They create different kinds of risk or different kinds of vulnerability that then interacts with the hazard, which produces different kinds of disaster outcomes. We also need to focus on our river systems as a means of managing risk in our city. And it's very exciting because our transformative marine management program, which has been developing over the last few years, really is at the center of that. And isn't it amazing that Durban's already got that platform in place upon which we can build on these river systems as pathways of sustainability and disaster risk reduction? We also need to understand more about our topography and geology. So there was a very interesting report from an academic at Stellenbosch University about how our geology puts our city at risk of landslides. And we need to go back and remember and learn from that. And then look at our service provision and our road networks and the type of services we have in different areas, because of course Durban has a spatially differentiated service provision approach, and that all makes a difference in the way in which risk plays out. So we need to look at our different kinds of settlements, and particularly our most vulnerable, our informal settlements, and see how these types of settlements interface with risk. And then the third point I wanted to make was around disaster response. So we need to understand that there's always going to be this need for short-term responses. So what is the best short-term response? It needs to be context specific, and who provides that? And we know that the key things that come up are shelter, food, medicine, ID documents, services. And now we've learned from this recent flood that trauma counseling is actually essential at the local level. In the medium-term response, interestingly, we had a community meeting 2 weeks ago with municipal officials around sanitation and water response. And in that community meeting, the community raised the issue that actually sanitation and waste management were the most critical issues for them in their community post the disaster. Obviously, shelter is a longer term goal, but actually sanitation and waste were their immediate short-term needs. And you wouldn't think they would have highlighted waste as being such a critical issue. But of course, it brings in other health risks. The lack of sanitation impacts on people's safety and increases gender-based violence. We also learned from the communities that a lack of communication about the response from the state can lead to greater social conflict and also leads to ad hoc responses. So when there's no, and that's what I think communities are feeling on the ground at the moment, that there's no communication from local government or from any level of government about what the plan is to move forward. And so they're kind of operating in the dark, and therefore they're starting to respond in their own ways and doing these ad hoc responses. We've also learned in the medium term that you've got to be very careful, because while disaster opens up opportunities for good change and rebuilding, it also opens up opportunities for other forms of social disruption and violence, depending on the vulnerability of the community and the options available to respond to the disaster. So in some of the informal settlements I work in, post the floods, the kind of flood disaster has opened up more opportunities for the social deviance to occur through drugs and alcohol. So they start taking control of the communities in this kind of disaster moment after the floods. And it also starts to build social conflict. And we're seeing across our city this intense social conflict between those that moved to these care halls or into the churches and others who left the settlements when they lost their land and decompressed into other settlements. And now they've become invisible, because the state is focusing on those people that are in the churches. And that's creating a lot of social conflicts across communities. So this prioritization of care halls, while it is understandable, is actually very problematic, because there are lots of displaced people in other settlements and they're facing their own risks, but they are not getting the resources from the state. And that's creating a lot of conflict between community members in particular settlements. And we've also seen how political leadership and representation, the bigger politics of the city, plays out in these disasters. So whose ward you're in, who's the leading party in that ward or in that municipality, which ward you're in, who's your councillor, how's your councillor aligned, all of those factors start impacting on who gets what resources and why and how. And then, of course, we've got to think about how do we build back better? What kind of rebuilding are we doing? Do we take the learnings, for example, in informal settlements from the eThekwini informal settlement upgrading process and actually use that to rebuild better? Do we take the learning and our innovative sanitation research that we're doing in Durban around, for example, the Luwat toilet, and use that form of sanitation to build back better, because we've been innovating in other areas in the city? And how do we think about this longer term resettlement and localized climate adaptation? And this is just a piece from in 2019, this was a statement, a memorandum that the community in Quarry Road West actually wrote up in 2019 in response to the floods. And you can see they're able to identify their short-term needs and their longer-term needs, where they want to go, what are their short-term disaster response needs, because often the wrong kind of resources arrive in the settlement at the wrong time. So sometimes the building materials arrive 2 months later, and in fact, the community's already rebuilt those houses. So that building material then becomes redundant. So you've got to work with communities to understand their needs and to understand that actually, in most cases, communities want to work with the municipality. They want to stay together as communities, use their own social capital, and then engage in partnerships with the municipality to build back better. So to end off, I wanted to just reflect on some of the lessons learned from the 2019 and 2022 floods, just from some of the research that we've been doing. And one of the things that's interesting is that in both floods, environmental scientists have told us this amount of rainfall should not have caused this much damage. So we really have to think about why this has happened. And I'm just wondering if there isn't some way in which the rainfall of cut-off low systems behaves in a different way that we don't fully understand yet. So maybe the physical hazard is still part of the story as to why there was so much damage. The nature of that rain under these cut-off lows, which actually cause all the damage. We also need to learn that this longitudinal forecasting over time and space, which is given very accurately by SAWS, is hugely useful to cities, because SAWS had already told us that we were in a very saturated phase in Durban, as Malcolm said, because of the high rainfall due to El Niño. SAWS also is able to give us 2 to 3 days rainfall warning, which then enables us to prepare in the way that we did through our early flood warning system. So how do we work with SAWS to kind of develop this better, and how do we understand that it's not always predictable? You know, the ideas of chaos theory, that small changes in the system, like we've seen with storm cells, and Jeff's actually alerted that to us through the Fuse system before, where he'll have a storm cell that he's monitoring and suddenly it'll change and behave in a different way, like we saw in the 2019 floods. And then we had 2 storm cells late at night again that caused absolute disaster. So we've got to be aware of the unpredictability of these systems and therefore be responsive. How do we think about the vulnerability and context? All of these things about land use planning, land use infrastructure, the kind of environmental degradation we have in the city, how do these all contribute to the vulnerability in the context? And as I said, the early warning system, I think, played a major role in the case study that we've worked on in preventing loss of life, which is hugely important. How do we learn from the system and scale it up? What is the value of these settlement risk profiles? So to re-emphasize this idea of building geographic literacy so that we can identify hotspots under different conditions. So as we see these weather systems evolving, both at the, from SAWS at a higher level scale to the FUSE system, which gives us a local scale, then if we have these risk profiles, we can respond much more quickly to knowing what's going to happen. How do we develop capabilities across all actors? And so capabilities exist across the state, citizens, and these intermediaries that I spoke about. And how do we engage in processes of social learning? One of the things that really upsets me is that I've seen how capabilities and options are reduced after each disaster event if the disaster response is not socially and environmentally formative. So what we see here is the case study of Quarry Road West. This is after the floods in 2019, where we had this large area where Gift of the Givers came. Within one day, we managed to get them there. There was an incredibly organized flood response, disaster response from Gift of the Givers given to the community. The community organized who got what resources, when and how, and in a very safe way, and we were able to do that. In 2022, there was absolutely no space in the settlement left anymore for Gift of the Givers to arrive and actually distribute goods. So we couldn't actually use their services because they won't distribute unless we can guarantee a safe system and a space to distribute resources. So what you see is that resilience gets undermined. What happens also in these disasters is that after disasters, communities act fast. They have to, because they have to survive. They have to carry on living. But the state acts slowly for all the reasons that Malcolm spoke about: regulations, bureaucracy, preparation, planning properly, funding. But that doesn't interface well with the ability of communities to act fast to deal with a disaster. And so you can see here, this was the 2019 flood drone image that we flew. And you saw in 2019, this settlement had this huge land area that was still open in the settlement. Because there was no immediate response to shelter and people had lost their land, very quickly people started to build houses on that space. And so by the time we got to the 2022 floods, you can see that that whole land area is built up. There's no land available. That any buffer zones within this community were gone. And so now people have had to move into churches and there's no response. Dealing with trauma is very important. So we've learned from this event how traumatic it is when people could never believe what would happen actually takes place in their community. So I'm using SD here. He's one of the Green Corridor monitors. He's been involved in our projects for many years. He's a huge activist around flooding in and climate adaptation in the settlement. He's the one along with Samiso. So together in partnership, SD and Samiso put up these warning tapes on the Monday of the flood to warn people to move away from the banks of the river due to the flooding. And I'll never forget on the day after the floods, meeting with SD and just seeing how traumatized he was because he's been engaged for so long to try and improve conditions in his community. So these kind of leaders who are trying to activate responses need counseling as much as the community members who experience the floods. And so what we did is we used the Municipal Institute at UKZN to take counsellors to this community to try and help them in the days post the flood. And what was amazing was that for most people, it was the fear of the sounds of rain and water. Any running water made particularly children very fearful. So I've learned the importance of trauma counselling in this. Also, post a flood, you need to know what to do very quickly after the flood. So here's a colleague of mine, Baloshan Govender. He's an architect after the 2019 floods coming in to look at which houses could be saved along these riverbanks. Because, of course, at this time, land and shelter is of paramount importance. And so we were doing designs here to see which of these houses that had been eroded on the riverbanks could be shored up and actually protected. We also need to learn from all the internal community adaptation practices and think about after these, what worked, what didn't work from the kinds, did the tires actually help people when they build up these kind of slopes? And of course, the TRMP is teaching us lots of lessons about river rehabilitation and protecting our catchments. So how do we build back better? And I think it's a lot to do with state-citizen relationships. How do we plan across silos in the municipality? So you've got to have interdepartmental coordination to address these kind of disasters. How do we draw on community knowledge and integrate that with what interdepartmental responses can be? So how do these multiple actors come together, and how do we build these governance platforms in the longer term, like the TRMP is doing, so that all of this kind of knowledge co-production can take place? And I think we've got to really think about, how do we do this? How do we work at the local scale, building governance platforms, sharing knowledge? Because with these floods, there's just been too much trauma in our city. It's just absolutely heartbreaking when you watch the kind of devastation to communities and you see all the previous development gains that have been built through the efforts of people on the ground and the state disappearing through the kind of events of these floods. And so it's starting to demand too much resilience from people. And I think together, if we work collaboratively, sharing knowledge, we can do a lot better. Thank you, Sean.
Oh, thank you very much, Kathy. A fantastic presentation, very wide-ranging, and it's so clear how the action research that Kathy leads in this Quarry Road West Informal Settlement is exactly the kind of research that's advocated and promoted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, speaking to community-based research, getting communities involved in the research themselves to help city government respond and prepare for future climate change impacts. You know, there was an excellent example of the community-based forecast early warning system and how long it took working with the community to get to a level of awareness where the warning systems were effective, how much commitment there's been from the different actors there, whether it's SD and the community members themselves, or Kathy working with the community and spending so much time in the community, or SMISO working as closely with the community as well, or Lee Death and the River Watch up in the catchment providing the data, or even Jeff Tooley. You know, every big storm event we have, Jeff is on the computer providing us with warnings. And so that commitment in itself is a risk for us, because what if we lose a Jeff and there's nobody to provide that warning? So, you know, in thinking of how we sort of upscale and make the community-based forecast early warning systems effective, maybe there's local groups that we can prepare in this model, and maybe there's a way to automate the messaging coming out of the forecast early warning system to make Jeff a little bit more redundant. As much as we appreciate what you do, Jeff, you're an amazingly committed official. Okay, we also heard about the importance of engagement across different actors to arrive at solutions, and how, you know, the issue of loss and damage has really impacted upon this community from the 2019 floods and the response to take up what available land there is, to the 2022 floods where there is no more available land, and then it becomes loss. Before we get into framing the actual discussion part of today, I would like to provide opportunity for some questions and answers again. I'm just trying to open my people thing so I can see who's asking. So we have two askers at the moment, Mark Misselhorn and then Alana Rebello again. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, you can.
Thanks. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, just a comment which relates to the scale of informal settlements that are impacted by severe weather, and in particular flood events, and a particular workflow that is planned, but we still seeking, you know, funding to implement it. Jeff's presented previously on the graduated risk assessment for flooding, for flood-prone settlements. There's about 11,000 households in informal settlements in the city that are within 1 in 100 year flood line. but that the actual households that are at severe risk and de facto risk is a much smaller number. So, you know, Kathy was talking about better knowledge and better planning and better preparation. So identifying and mapping those households based on the existing data is an exercise which I think is very important. No doubt Jeff will or can comment further on this tool that is being piloted, but we do need a better assessment, part of the differentiated pipeline plan for all of the settlements in the city, all of the almost 600 settlements and over 300,000 households, is to identify those households that are at the most severe risk, and flooding is definitely one of those risks. At this point, the 1 in 100 year flood line is a very coarse indicator, but within that 11,000 households, we need to get a lot better at identifying those households that are really at the most severe risk. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mark. I think there's more of a comment. Elana?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think my question of clarity links to that comment. So thanks for that, setting the scene. And just to say a huge thank you to Kathy. That was a fantastic presentation. I think everybody really enjoyed it. And yeah, I remember going out with you, I think it was in 2018, to visit the Quarry Road settlements and meet some of the community. So that was really it very much it was very influential in my life in shaping yeah, my understanding of these communities and how they can be so cohesive in the most difficult circumstances. But I remember then you shared with us that the municipality did have plans to move that settlement out of that inappropriate place, but that in the meantime the community was acting because there was nothing really it wasn't very likely that that was going to happen anytime soon. And here we are, like almost 10 years down the line. And I was just wondering whether there's any update on that. And while I ask this question, I ask it because then we wouldn't need, you know, any of this high tech, you know, or even if not high tech, high or low tech, but very like intensive communication, early warning system. Because if this whole community could be moved elsewhere where it was safer, you know, we wouldn't need that. So I was just wondering about, you know, what's the long-term vision and what are the, you know, like what actually is the municipality's goal there? And of course, I understand that everybody else has to act in the meantime, whether this happens or not. And then also, I understand that this is one community, and I've heard now that there are 600 informal settlements within the city. And then hearing from the previous person that there's something like, well, within the 1 in 100 year flood line, there's a significant number of houses. So I realize that this is just one community, but yeah, clearly there's some kind of mismatch here with the city and what the plans are going forward. And just it would be so good to have some clarity on that, maybe in the discussion later, as to what exactly the city's vision is, given these major economic drivers that are obviously pulling people in, that are in search of jobs, and they're willing to settle anywhere to be able to have that improved life. But what the city's role should be to make sure that, you know, it's not like that they lose their children or loss of life or something due to living in very bad areas. So yeah, that's
Thanks,
just my
Elana.
question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Kathy, to complete the trio of questions, I'll allow Malcolm Canham to ask as he was next. Thank you.
Dr. Sean, it's not a question. I want to thank Kathy firstly for a very informative presentation. Mine is more comments, so if you'd like to maybe take another question and then I can add my comment thereafter.
Thanks. Okay, Malcolm, we'll start with your comment in the discussion part, but let's move on then to Banani Madekizela, please.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks very much, Kathy, for this very informative presentation and the previous one, indeed, of Malcolm. I know these are very difficult things that you are going through, the questions and suggestions, but Kathy, from the research point of view, you mentioned that early warning, that there's a trust issue between who is saying what, and of course we have to rely on source. And source told us that they can only give an indication when it is a week or less that the trouble is coming. So there's this whole thing of how early is early. enough to save lives and property. So, Kevin, I was thinking of the citizen science early warning system kind of a tool where the citizens themselves, are part of generating that data so that they feel the ownership of the message, that this is us and it is the same as that of source anyway for credibility. But what do you think of that early warning system for citizens? I think that's in the space of research. And then the last one, I think Alana covered me, the city vision. We know that the global estimation is that by 2030 and beyond, we are getting to 70% of people urbanized. So surely we should be now preparing ourselves, not now, already, towards that kind of movement of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonani, and lovely to hear your voice again. Bonani from the Water Research Commission has had a long interest in the ecological infrastructure of the KwaZulu-Natal through the Mgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership. So lovely to speak to you again. Just touching on the early warning thing, I mean, SARS is SAWS, South African Weather Services, by law is mandated to provide those warnings. Nobody else can provide an early warning system and a warning on weather. And they did have a warning out days in advance, but it was at a very low level. And they only really ratcheted up to a very high warning on the Monday of the event before the really heavy rain started. So how long is enough of an advanced warning? You're absolutely correct. I suspect it was because of the deepening conditions that emerged with the cutoff low probably intensified on that Monday, which was the reason for that late warning. But perhaps, Kathy, I'll hand over to you to answer the set of three.
So thank you very much for the excellent questions. I think there are two issues here. If I take the early flood warning system that is being spoken about, hopefully we showed that in the case that we developed, this was citizen science, because all of the actors in that network, whether it's Lee Deeth or Patrick Martel collecting water in their rain gauges and giving us information on the ground higher up in the catchment, if it's community members sending us images and reporting back on their knowledge of what the river's doing, because they've also learned about how the river behaves, all of that knowledge comes into our early warning system. And where the source information is very important is that, as you said, Sean, that is the legal route to providing a warning system, a weather warning in the beginning. And we got that warning, but where the source warning system, and you'll know that you will have seen the kind of risk system that's been developed by SAWS, and I was at a workshop run by the WRC in Pretoria just recently, where I actually met the SAWS researchers that have developed that system, where you get a grid with the high level, changes from orange, green to red when you get to 10, when we know it's an absolute severe warning. And Patrick Martel had picked up that warning early on the Monday, I think you had as well, Sean, and put that on the group. And where that warning was important, although it was only on the Monday that we got it, that gave us the courage in the early warning system that we have to actually start telling people to evacuate and move, because SAWS had told us that it had elevated to a level 10. So as you'll know from working on this group with us, Sean, and others in this group are part of it too, is that sometimes we have warnings that we get given and they don't materialize into these terrible floods or these disasters. And when we've sent out too much weather warnings or too many risk warnings, communities become scared, they become fearful. And it creates a lot of stress for them. And also then it creates this response that, well, maybe the flood won't happen. So I think what we've learned in this process that we've done is that where the different levels of SAWS warnings come in is that they give us the courage in our group when we need to start saying to people, move backwards, move your stuff, get away from the settlement. We can do that because SAWS has given us the correct information at that level, that we now at a risk level 10. And that was the image that we got on the Monday. Samisa also had access to it so that we could give very significant warnings to the community. And I think when we talk about the other settlements across the city, and we work in a lot of different informal settlements in the city, of course, what we're trying to learn now is how we take this very focused and detailed response system that we've developed, and you made the point as well, Sean, and how do we scale it up so that it can become part of all the settlements in the city, whether it's informal settlements in the peri-urban areas where there's risks of landslides. That's the kind of work we need to do. And Jeff's been talking about that for a long time, and we have been working on that. And that's part of the work of the TRMP as well. So I think what we, the next phase of work, and we're still working carefully to understand what actually worked and what didn't, is in how do we start building up the system, and then we can use it citywide to try and develop these networks. And of course, they'll all be different in different contexts. But I think, and the rest of you in this group that are part of this with me might want to add too, is that I think we've learned enough now that we can use what we've learned in this case study to really develop these across the city. In terms of the informal settlements, as the questions have alluded to, and particularly Alana's question, it's exactly the point. I mean, what is the vision for the city in terms of informal settlements? The city's had a very progressive program that I've worked on along with Mark Misselhorn and Sarah Watson and Human Settlements around, and Faisal Sedat, around incremental informal settlement upgrading, which is what the city's trying to promote. And it's gone into the level of policy approved by council. And so this idea of where you upgrade informal settlements in situ is very much based on environmental risk. And that's the mapping that Mark was talking about. So we really now need to move forward on the kind of key lessons learned from eThekwini program, which were really important for the city from this 4-year program, and to then take that work and integrate it with our disaster risk management. So that will be ongoing work, because exactly like you say, Alana, what we have to deal with is nobody wants anyone living in a settlement like Quarry Road. The community themselves understand the huge risk, but they can't move far from there, because that's where all the economic opportunities are. That's where they get access to urban resources. And so they need, and informal settlers always choose locations that are economically good for them and meet their needs. And that's why they're located in spaces right across the city. But they have to trade that off with high environmental risk. So how do we build their resilience in the meantime? And then how do we have this vision, part of which eThekwini has tried to develop, that then changes the landscape of informal settlements across the city and reduces the risk for those very high-risk settlements. And that's the kind of categorization that Mark Misselhorn's worked on for many years. So these are all works in progress, and of course your questions are all very relevant to that kind of work that we're doing.
No, thanks very much, Kathy. We've got literally 4 minutes left of your segment here, so I'm going to, it doesn't matter if we run over a little bit, but we can't run over a lot. So I'm going to ask the next 3 people to be very succinct in asking your questions. And Kathy, if you can try to be succinct in your answers as well, because then we will go into the discussion part. And I have 2 directed questions at our 2 presenters to lead that off. So in the meantime, can I ask Saneli, Faisal, and Lee to please ask your questions, but please be succinct.
Hello.
We can hear you, Saneli.
Yes, okay. Thanks, Sean. This is Saneli from Gaining Water. Massive thanks to our presenters thus far. My question is just on, I don't know whether it's been covered as of yet, but the use of emergency disaster drills, especially as we're saying that they're becoming quite prevalent and frequent, and how whether the city is using those as just as a measure of actually making sure that especially our communities are better prepared in terms of being able to respond themselves, both on an individual and on a community basis, because it's quite a shock, especially to the system, for a disaster event happening in a community, and how I think it mitigates or makes things a bit more better if it's something that is drilled, especially in terms of processes of what to do next when such an event actually happens, and just currently how that is actually being carried out in terms of disaster drills, seeing them as effective. Do they see their relevance, especially within the communities that they've dealt with, or is there like space for improvement as well? Just on that, in terms of emergency disaster drills and their effectiveness, and is there a need for them to be done more on a more frequent basis, seeing that these events are becoming more and more frequent themselves? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Saneli. Fantastic question, and maybe one that both Kathy and Malcolm might want to answer. Faisal?
Thanks, Sean. Just in response to, and by the way, fantastic presentation, Kathy. Very informative as usual. Just from a city's perspective, responding to questions about the informal settlement itself and to other settlements in the city. I think Alana mentioned that I think over 10 years ago there was an option to relocate the entire settlement. At that time, I think the numbers were around 600 or so. And so a suitable housing project was developed, and all 600 families were given that opportunity of relocating. Unfortunately, I think only half took that opportunity. The other half, 300, remained behind. And unfortunately, through the years, the settlement grew. And I think today it's, more than 1,000 households. So there was a missed opportunity, but I do understand people want to be in particular locations because of the socioeconomic opportunities. But nevertheless, the city did provide an option to a suitable project in the north, which was, in an urban area. It had already a school in place, but, very difficult to get, schools developed for housing projects, but here one was available. Nevertheless, Kathy did mention that we have an incremental upgrading strategy approved by council. It's a new approach looking at informal settlements. The principle of upgrading people where they are still remains with us. And so we have categorized all our informal settlements, and we would address them
chairing a workshop
as per those categories. I think opportunities, within Ward 23 are very few. There's a number of informal settlements in that ward, and there's very few opportunities, in terms of small pockets of land to develop, and that's where we sit with the challenge. Any relocation, of that settlement will require us looking at land outside that ward, and unfortunately, the entire community can't be, housed in one project, and that's unfortunate. So, as a city, we mentioned, I think, it was mentioned earlier, 590 plus informal settlements, 316,000 households. We get funding from national government that will allow us to, say, develop 4,000 units, the RDP or the BNG units per annum. You can do the sums, and it'll tell you how long it'll take to actually meet this backlog. That 4,000 is not only for informal settlements. We've got to look at backyard shacks, overcrowding, the rural background, etc., emergencies. So it's quite a huge challenge on the city, and with that we have increasing urbanization. So the strategy helps us to deal with upgrading in an incremental way on land that can be developed, and we will continue to look at developable land in the city to accommodate those, like, for instance, the corridor informal settlement, especially portions of them that can't be developed. But there's no guarantee that we can accommodate everyone within the same ward, and that's the reality.
Thanks very much for that. And just for clarity for all our listeners, Faisal is actually from Human Settlements. So that wasn't a question of clarity, but it was actually a part of the discussion section of our today. So thanks very much for that input, and we're all better for it. So we did have a hand up from Lee just now, but Lee, I see you've taken your hand down. If you do still want to, yes, do you want to ask a question, Lee?
Yes. Good morning, and thank you to the presenters. Very interesting and appreciated. My name's been mentioned a couple of times, and I thought I'd just say hello to everybody. Yes. When we saw what a risk the informal settlement was, we set up a completely separate and independent early warning system, slightly different because we accommodate communication directly with both informal settlements on both sides of the river, because they're both below the flood line or at risk in a floodplain, where they're at risk from the Mzanyati River flood, the Umgeni River, and the Palmeet. So with high tides and any one of those high intensity rain, that informal settlement could be swallowed up in a second or very rapidly. In this particular case, Cathy showed the slides of that big chunk of houses that disappeared, and there was also a row of houses all the way down the settlement on the west side, which she spoke about, and as it's described, they went like clattering down like a row of trains when they were washed away. And we actually had a different approach. We didn't rely on SARS completely. We saw 3 days before there were three other forecast systems indicating that there was very intense rain coming, and we had warned the people before that a day would come when total evacuation, whether it was raining or not, was be required. And we started warning them and kept them awake through the night. And then it wasn't actually a power outage we discovered, but it was the illegal connections that were snapping as the houses went down. So as they were evacuating and trying to cross across the river, sort of up to their knees in water, they suddenly found themselves in the dark and they ran out of battery. Anyway, that's a long story. What I wanted to sum up to say that I can put something together in terms of what happened.
Please, can you be concise?
I'm finishing off now. Time. Thanks, Sean. I'm finishing off. I just say I'll put something together in writing and send it through for everybody to share. But on an optimistic note, we have the Palmeet Rehabilitation, Catchment Rehabilitation Project, which the sole purpose of this project was to look at ecological infrastructure and the impacts and the causes of flooding across land rather than just the rivers. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Lee. So, Cathy, there was really only one question in there, and that was from Banani around community-led forecast early warning systems. If you'd like to have a...
Going back to Sanele's point, I think about education and disaster drills. I think that's an absolutely critical point, that we should include those in our risk profiles and the way we develop these risk profiles that I've been thinking about. And I think importantly, going into the next sections, Sean, we've obviously focused on Quarry Road West because that was the kind of lens that I used to tell the story. And of course, it's the detailed work we've done. But I think what we've learned in this catchment is actually what we need to then think about across the whole city. So of course, this flooding, as we saw from Malcolm's presentation, was citywide. There were terrible landslides in the peri-urban areas, a lot of them under traditional authority governance, because of the kind of way in which city building from below is happening in those areas. So I think what I'd like to say is, and I understand the focus landed up on Quarry Road because that's what I was presenting, but I think let's try and think of the lessons, the broader lessons learned from this particular case and say, okay, what does that mean for disaster risk management across our city as we have to prepare and be more prepared for the kind of climate risks we're going to face? So what can we take as all of the lessons learned, and some of the questions are really important, and think about then what does that mean for disaster risk management across our city? And from this kind of work that I've presented, are there lessons from that that we can use then to scale up and to use in different settlement typologies across our city so that we build a more resilient and sustainable city? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Cathy. And that's pretty much how I wanted to frame the remaining sort of 15 minutes we have for discussion here. And that is to direct questions, two questions to you and Malcolm. Firstly, to Malcolm is, in presenting us with a disaster management framework, can you please comment on what sort of capacity do we need to act at a scale that's suitable for the scale of the disaster we saw there? And secondly, how do we incorporate this kind of action research learnings into our disaster management framework? And then to Cathy, it would be, in trying to engage with the city after the 2019 floods, the community knew what they needed. So how do we improve that ability to engage and to find solutions? And then, as you said, your ability, your research that you've done now in a very highly localized, how do we extend that research at scale and or taking the learnings and implement them at scale? So Malcolm, you had a comment you wanted to make, so I'll allow you to make that comment, and if you could spend sort of 2 to 3 minutes answering your questions, then we'll do Cathy, and then we'll open up for a round of questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sean. Indeed, in pausing, I think then all the experts and the responsible people came to the table and answered what I was going to. So mine was just mainly to supplement what Kathy had been raising. Now, let's quick. One of the things that came up was early warning, and I just want to compare meteorological incidents and early warning there with industry. So if we have a tank, let's say at Cutler in the South Durban Basin, a tank with product that's on fire, for example, we are able to quantify that far easier. We might ask what's in the tank, what quantity, what are the properties of what's in the tank, how is it going to affect the environment and people. So easily quantifiable in terms of early warning. So the tanks on fire, tell us, so you've got enough time to talk to the community, for example. With weather issues, it's different, as we've just seen in April and May, that widespread, where do you start? Everyone's issue is more important than the others. And thankfully, Quarry Road West, we didn't have to worry about too much because of knowing the systems that are in place, even as urgent as it might have been. But early warning, different horses for courses, and so we have to watch there. So even in weather warnings, systems intensify as Kathy was saying, and we're seeing this every day. So when it goes pop, it's sometimes too late in that respect. And before I quickly answer your question, Dr. Sean, let me just flight up this one little slide that I added to the presentation. And so if you see now the causal factors of disasters, firstly, rapid urbanization, and it's an international trend. People are moving to the cities and the metros. That rapid urbanization causes densification, problem right there. Increased population, and this is why there's the movement as well. And then people moving in don't have access to systems. Perhaps their education levels are lesser. There's a lack of awareness, even of the risk in the particular space. Poverty levels impact that, and changes in cultural practice. But let's zoom in on Quarry Road West. Umpteen times have we said to people, do not build in that area. You've seen what happens, and then you come back a month later, people have built there again. Why? Because it talks to this aspect of acceptable risk. And people say, well, the river's going to come down once a year. And so for maybe 9 months of 12, I'm fine. Fires occur now and then, so the majority of time it's okay. So I'm prepared to accept that risk, and that's where a big challenge comes in. It increases vulnerability, but it reduces the official response to that, in the sense that you can undertake public awareness and people will not listen because they're prepared to accept certain risk. They tolerate that, and to try and work against that is driving uphill in a sense. Let me go to your two questions then regarding capacity. Now, if we ask Lebo what he has in the Western Cape, if you look at the organogram of Cape Town, of Johannesburg, the other big metros, far more than eThekwini currently has in place. We've managed to bring in formally 12 more people to our base, which takes us just over 20, which is far, it's far under the numbers that we should have. For us, the work that's being done at Quarry Road West should be undertaken by disaster management if we had the capacity in terms of human capital. So we are way under where we should be, and we need to increase the organogram as quickly as possible. Why? Because with a small number, you are only able to undertake horizontal involvement and not vertical involvement. So we couldn't spend a whole host of time dealing with and drilling in at Quarry Road West or any settlement, for example. So our capacity requirements are way under, and that has to improve. It's a big weakness that the Metro has had for a long time. Let's talk then, your second question refers to incorporation of such research. Now, when I was studying community risk assessment in Cape Town, the process was, at the end of the day, you brought in the people and the agencies that respond, and you said to them, said to the community, who is close to you? And they would map those who helped them all the time there. So if we did that at Quarry Road West, we'd find Kathy's name right up there. We'd find Lee's name right up there. We'd find Jeff Tooley's name right up there. And then disaster management, oh, they come when the fires or with the incidents. So the involvement is only for emergencies. Where do we incorporate research and think tanks and the whole academic section is at the Disaster Management Advisory Forum. Now, all these concepts are very good, but if they don't really live up to what they're supposed to be doing, then it's useless. But I would suggest then the municipal and at all three spheres of government, the advisory fora sit, and at the Disaster Management Advisory Forum, this plays a vital role, as you, Dr. Shaw, would know, with the map and a climate change map, that plugs in there as a task team in itself. And we should be saying to the city management through this kind of information, if you do nothing about that, then, and so this is where we suggest you should go. So it looks at risk reduction in totality. Hopefully that responds adequately.
Lovely. Thanks, Malcolm. You're actually absolutely spot on. I guess the mandated body is the Disaster Management Advisory Forum. Skalk, we'll get to you in a minute. We just want to give Kathy a chance to provide a response to the two questions I raised, and then we'll take your question first.
Yeah, sure, and I'll try and give a quick response. I mean, I think this big question of capacity and capabilities is what we need to answer, because hopefully what I was trying to show in the presentation is that the capabilities sit across a wide range of actors. And I think one of the challenges, and I mean, I'm very proud in South Africa to be part of a developmental state where we have a very interventionist state that takes a lot of responsibility on its shoulders. But that can't deal, exactly as Malcolm said, you can't put all of those feet on the ground. And so what we're seeing in these collective projects, and we've seen that across Durban in so many instances where we've had these major disruptions, is it's a collective action of a wide range of actors, ordinary citizens, local government, universities, NGOs, civil society organizations working together. So in the case of what we've built in the Palmy catchment, disaster risk management can come and provide support. They don't have to do all of those functions because they've already got people on the ground doing it. You've got connections across different municipal departments that facilitate us being able to do the work that we do. So in fact, I think it's about the role of the state and the role of non-state actors in how we build these collaborative platforms that actually can do this work for us. But it's very difficult for our state because, of course, being the government of South Africa or the state of South Africa means you're a developmental state and you want to take responsibility for everything. And I think that's where the role of the state's got to shift in certain ways, and how you build these partnerships like we've tried to do in the Palmy Catchment Project between the states and citizens. And of course, bringing in the private sector is still our key missing element, but we're starting to do that in some of the other work that we're doing. So I think that, you know, we've got to also have a responsive state. Kira made the point that the group of activists that are trying to contact the mayor and the city manager, they've had absolutely no response from them. You can see that memorandum written by the Quarry Road community in 2019 was actually delivered to the desk of the deputy city manager at that time. And again, there was no sort of formal response from that high level of leadership. So perhaps we need to engage our city leadership in disaster risk management in our city and really get their vision for it and to see what kind of leadership role they want to play, because that's where we all go to when we get really stuck. They are the leaders of our city. And you've heard two examples of where we're waiting for responses from them. So perhaps it's just thinking about, you know, how the state responds to citizens. And then how do you research, scale this up? Well, I think we're learning a lot of things. I've been thinking quietly and within, I mean, it's not me, it's this whole team of people that are thinking and working hard. I think we can transfer, how do we transfer this knowledge to the landslide risk, for example, that we're going to see more and more in our city, and that form of governance and how that changes things. So I think we've got a lot of interesting work ahead from all of us, and whoever wants to collaborate is most welcome, because I think together, collectively, we can build on what we know. And where it's been tough for Durban is we had big floods in 2019, and no one would have imagined we would have had even more serious floods 2 years later. So these floods are coming at us hard and fast. There's other, I mean, we had the social unrest, we had COVID. So our city's got to build its resilience. And I think we've got to just draw on whatever lessons we have and work together. And we can scale this up. I think there's some key elements of what we've learned in the last few years that we can certainly scale up and try and produce across the city. And we've got to think of ways of doing it. Thanks.
No, thanks, Kathy. You're absolutely so spot on that, it's not just about flooding. There's a whole range of impacts, whether it's climate or whether it's socio-economic things or even the viruses that, as a city, university community, communities on the ground, we need these platforms that have strong political and top-down leadership, but also strong bottom-up participation and guidance as well to guide our actions going forward. We are running out of time now, so I'm going to take these next two questions, please, and then we'll see how we are doing after that, whether we start wrapping up. I'd like to wrap up from 25 past onwards. Thanks. Skolk and then Kira, please ask your questions. You might be muted, Skolk. We can't hear you.
Sorry,
There you go.
I'm one of that before computers person. Thanks for all the presentations this morning, Doc, and also for everything that you shared. I'm from the Western Cape, a professional disaster manager working at the Western Cape Disaster Management Centre. I'm going to give professional inputs now, academical inputs. Just two, the problem of what Malcolm mentioned is poverty and urbanization, change of cultural practices. That is the main causal factors of all the problems currently that we experience in the informal settlement areas and at-risk communities. For instance, in 22 years ago, when I came into the Western Cape, there's 1.9 million people staying in Cape Town. The city of Cape Town. There's currently 4.7 million people staying in the same vicinity. What we have is also the in-migration. I've done as research. My postgraduate qualification was all to do with in-migration into the Western Cape. That we had 48,000 people then migrating into the Western Cape. That figure exceeds 100,000 now yearly. People that permanently migrate to the Western Cape. The biggest problem is, and I saw Kathy showed that area that was vacant. People tend now to go and stay on dangerous areas because of they're in danger. If something happens, they will get to be they qualify to get urgently being provided with more permanent housing. And also that they then jump the queue. The housing list in Cape Town is over 600,000 housing units. People are staying in informal sectors, in backyard shacks, backyard Wendy houses. That is my one point I want to make. So I think it's a universal problem in all the cities currently that people are coming and they stay on railway tracks next to the railway lines. They're staying under bridges. They go and stay under the Eskom power lines. Even in Cape Town, we've got people staying on in drift sands. About 20,000 people staying on a dam wall that can collapse anytime. And the people don't want to move. Lastly, the other thing is the problem that Malcolm raised, the capacity. Disaster management has got the authority. And it should be everyone's business. But unfortunately, we wait until a disaster happens, and then we want to look at who's responsible. We've done research in the Western Cape. I specifically asked for that research. Who owns the hazard, firstly, and who owns the consequence of the hazard? And we work totally on the constitution, on the different legislation, and then we determine who the owners should be. But if you don't have political will, and political will from a national, provincial, and local level, we as disaster managers cannot do our job as it is written in legislation and directed in legislation. So this is a thing that we ought to take up. Disaster management is everyone's business, and then if it's safe, for instance, transport's responsibility, let they then fund whatever they are necessary to fund. We can't wait until a disaster happens and then do the funding. That's all from my side. I tried to be as short as possible, but it's more comments than a question. Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, Bongani. I'll ask Kira and Bongani, thanks, Golk. I'll ask Kira and Bongani to try and keep your inputs to 30 seconds, and then we can include Roy as well. And that will be the last comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I will do. I'm wondering whether we can't sort of request directly from disaster management. I do understand it's always easier if political leadership has come on board, but there have been formal letters gone out to those leaders. But I think it's well within the mandate to call a sort of advisory and participatory forum quite soon. I worry that if there isn't someone sort of coordinating and convening, you start to get all these disparate processes happening. For example, I know that COCTA is doing a provincial review and improvement in disaster risk reduction right now on KZN. I'm hoping very much that Kathy has at least been consulted in that, as well as the municipality in some of this. But the CSIR is also, as we speak, doing a very detailed mapping of climate risk about these floods. And I think that quickly we need a coordinating body that starts to share this knowledge and integrate some of these findings more broadly. Thanks.
Thanks, Kira. I'm going to pull that into a concluding statement at the end. Bongani, and please quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Kira, for that. I think I'm partially covered because my question was to ask if there's anyone in the meeting that's sort of like the GIS specialist, because I think it's very important for us to actually understand as to all the areas that were highly impacted during the flooding, so that we become proactive rather than being reactive, because we've seen in many occasions that we more of reactive rather than being proactive. So I think, yeah, I think we need to have the GIS specialist. We do have quite a number of people that can actually assist in this regard, in order for us to focus mainly on the areas where they were highly impacted during the floods, not with ignoring other areas, but I think we need to ask ourselves a question as to why these areas were highly affected. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Bongani. And we have got some studies undergoing, and there is GIS capability, so spot on there. And then finally, Roy.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. I'll try and be quick. The biggest frustration I've got is we haven't seen 1 cent yet of disaster funding relief coming from National Treasury or Provincial Treasury. And I ask the question with the greatest respect, what was the point of the President declaring this a national disaster if after 4 months we're still waiting to place orders to repair and replace severely damaged electrical equipment? And as you can probably hear, I'm from the Electricity Service Unit in eThekwini, and we had at least 15 major substations flooded. Photographs were shown earlier. I can't place orders or get equipment to replace that until we get national disaster funding. And as much as this presentation has been extremely professional and good, my worry is going forward. What are we going to do to get the city back to what it was prior to the floods? Thank you, Chair.
No, thanks, Roy. And that actually sets me up brilliantly for concluding now, because it's clear that, you know, there's the level of participation today and the high level of you know, not just in numbers, but the high level of engagement and the questions, real life questions like Roy's just asked now, means we have to do something with this conversation. We need to bring this conversation to city leadership, and we need a vehicle to take that. So I know Mile has coordinated this presentation today, but my question, research, and maybe we'll follow up with our DRAP, the Durban Research Action Partners, because this was organized through our Durban Research Action Partnership, is can we take some of the key points that have emerged from this chat today, incorporate them into something like a disaster management advisory forum document that we can take to city leadership, because our city manager chairs the DMAF, and then can we build something out of this? So that would be what my question, as I hand over to Mile to close us and tell us how we're going to take this forward. I would just like to say, firstly, thank you to our two presenters for their excellent topics. Thanks to everyone for participating today and being so engaged, and your level of interest and commitment to the process. And thanks to the organizers once again, Mile. Janice, I'll hand over to you to close.
Thank you, Sean, for facilitating the session. This is one of the most well-attended virtual events we have hosted, so thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to our presenters, Malcolm and Prof Sutherland, for your insightful presentations. Thank you, Smiso, Preshni, and Sean again. This webinar is a collaboration between DRAP and Mile. We value this partnership and its contribution to knowledge sharing. This was indeed a very valuable and informative session. There were several key learnings and themes that surfaced during the discussions today. We are in the planning phase of hosting a crisis management learning exchange later this year, so please watch this space. Presentations will be uploaded onto the Mile website. I will be sending the presentation and video recording links to participants who completed the registration form. If you didn't, please complete the form. That concludes the webinar. Thank you so much for your active participation. Goodbye and take care.
Cheers, folks. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.